Hello, welcome to this video. It's part of the library of IT-related videos available to you via the Central and North London branches network of the British Computer Society, the Chartered Institute for IT. My name is Darlin Basu, and I'm chairman of BCS Central and North London branches. My email is shown bottom right on the screen. Feel free to email me if you wish, and especially if you too would like to present a non-commercial video 15 minutes long for this library of video. Now, this session is about project management, including in difficult times. Our guest presenter is David Lewis, who is the chairman of PMI Consult. Welcome, David, and over to you.
Thank you, Darren, for that introduction. Let me share with you my screen, which I hope you now can see. So we're going to talk about those very basic project management skills that you all learned and which you sometimes tuck away at the back of your brain, but never perhaps utilize as much as we realize until we have a crisis, and a pandemic such as the one we're currently enduring is a very relevant subject for these skill sets. So a little bit about me, as you can see on the screen, including a contact email. I've been in the banking and financial services industry for some 40 years, most recently running for 25 years my own banking and financial services consultancy. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you today is a bit like teaching my good friends to suck eggs, but the reality is it's embedded in our thinking every day and the way in which we manage projects. So one of the first things that comes across is when you're told that there's going to be a new project, you have to ask yourself, why is it that we suddenly have this need for a new project? And those of you who are working in any industry know that this is a constantly changing business. And if we don't change, then basically our business will slowly wither on the vine and die. And therefore, there is this need for constantly reviewing the way in which you conduct your business. And what I put at the very top here is an idea that it is very important that you do have a clear understanding of your starting point. So you need to understand your business very well. You need to have done the business process analysis and looked at your documentation and critically review that in order to look at where you can achieve these efficiencies, because presumably our project is based upon the idea of some cost-benefit analysis. In other words, the cost of doing this project will be less than the benefits that we hope to achieve at the end of it. And it's very interesting here just to make that comparison with the government's own strategy here in the pandemic, where they were looking at a cost-benefit analysis initially, which seems to suggest that allowing herd exposure for the population might be the quickest way to pass through this. But then they realized that the cost of such a strategy looked too high in terms of the death toll, and they moved instead to a staged confinement solution, which is what we're having to suffer today. Of course, the other side of this coin is to look at the risk of a project against the eventual reward that we hope to achieve. And that, of course, should not be confused with the necessity, as we'll look later, in actually doing a full risk assessment of the project. But I think it's very important that if you don't measure the cost and the benefit beforehand, you have nothing against which to judge how successful or otherwise the project has been, and therefore to see whether in fact you did achieve all the benefits that you hope to achieve. And as well, let's also remember that we need to have some very clear before and after pictures in our head of how we will look at the end compared with where we are at the moment. And for most of us, that might be an architectural diagram showing the before strategic architecture against the final strategic architecture. But in the context of our own pandemic, you can imagine that the demands were very much more about the criteria we were looking for more intensive care beds, more personal protection equipment, what strategy we would have about the number of ventilators we required, and how we were going to get that better pre and post infection testing and even eventually, hopefully, a vaccine. And finally, we need to know, even before we start the project, we need to know how it's going to end. And in respect to that, from a government point of view, do they clearly have an exit strategy to move us from where we are to where we want to be? One of the first things we learn as a project manager is it's absolutely critical to get political buy-in. And that could, again, not be clearer in the context of product sponsors. We need to make sure we get a top-down approach, and we basically achieve the cultural change internally that we're seeking to have, as well as the business change. In the government context here, we have a gentleman called Dominic Cummings, I think I may have misspelled his name, which means to try and shake up our civil service and try and get some very original ideas into government. One of those, and certainly, would be zero budgeting. In other words, making no presumptions or no necessity to maintain a status quo. But for any project, making sure that we have the political will to change the system is very important. Because no matter how good the technical side, if we don't have the political will, a project will fail. So in the context of how that looks in a project sense, steering committees need to be created. We need to put in place the responsible people, and that should include the political sponsors of the project. You could liken it to the COBRA meetings that are going on in government today. Whereas we then require to include an executive committee, an executive action, which represents perhaps the civil service and the NHS leaders we should have there. And all these people need to buy into a communication strategy. How are we going to communicate to all the interested parties in this project? The government, of course, has gone for daily briefings to try and make sure that they communicate where they are in their strategy to the wider public. But internally too, for those who are specifically involved in the project, it's very important to have a communication strategy, a public relations strategy that makes sure you're getting the right messages out at each stage of the project. It's not just a matter of having a green light, an orange light, or a red light. You need to be telling people what they need to be doing and how they need to be doing it. And that needs to be a constant process throughout the life of the project. One of the first things that we have to do with our project is identify what other suppliers we're going to utilize within that project, depending on what resources we need to bring in. And this tends to be done long before we get into detailed project planning. But remembering that we've now got a picture of our existing system, we can go out and do our own research around which suppliers are the right ones to approach, whether it be for resourcing, for technical equipment, for physical goods, whatever it may be that our project involves. And in the context of our current crisis, you can think about it in terms of the way the government now is moving into finally coordinating with testing labs in the private sector, looking at test kit suppliers and ventilator builders and people who might be able to contribute to their demands. Most of that will finally get analyzed into some sort of RFP, a request for a proposal, which goes out in writing. And then once we get the responses to those RFPs from our suppliers, we're looking at response evaluation techniques, finally some contract negotiation. And then throughout the course of the project, there are great skills to be applied in the area of supplier management, making sure that we are all on the same page as to when we need deliveries, and making sure that we have that just-in-time delivery mechanism in place, and the relevant support from the supplier should make sure we get knowledge transfer. The next thing is really to define our project more closely. And in a way, it's hard to do the chicken and egg between the RFP and the project definition and scope as to which comes first. Probably the project definition and scope might need to come first. You need to know where are the boundaries of your project and what it is we are going to change and what it is we are going to keep the same. And you have to understand the full impact of the plan changes on the other areas of the business. It's a great fault often not to have created some sort of critical path and to understand all the interdependencies, and clearly interdependency is what we're looking at here. Have that clear before and after picture. But one of the big mistakes you see in many projects, particularly in the technology space, is a failure to understand that part of the objective of the project should be to retire some elements of the legacy structure that we had in place. And that could be true of physical buildings, could be true of technology. I've seen too many projects fail when new solutions are brought into play, which are simply overlaid across the existing structure without enough consideration given to legacy. So I would highly recommend that you think strongly about what you are looking to retire as part of your project scope and definition. And I again would highly recommend, as we talked before about cost benefit, try and avoid like-for-like replacement projects. If you're doing that simply to maintain a vendor support for a particular level of technology, these projects are seen as extraordinarily expensive and bringing no benefit to the users. And I would highly recommend that do not do like-for-like projects if you wish to maintain the support of your users and your sponsors. This is a recipe for failing to get approval on your next project. We do need to write our project plan, and no matter what tool we use, we need to consider the fact that there really are only three variables within our project. Those are the time we allocate for the project, the resource level, and the required effort. It's really critical to think about that resource level and to realize that most of the personnel that you're looking to utilize on this project will already be committed in full-time jobs. And if this is going to add an additional workload, you need to think about how you're going to fill those gaps and how you're going to make sure that the knowledge transfer goes to your existing staff and not to those third-party consultants that you may bring in. PMI has always had a philosophy of trying to bring together the skill sets of a supplier, the skill sets of your existing staff, and bridging that gap with consulting resource. And that tripartite approach has been where we have been most successful. You need to prepare a budget, and that needs to be a financial budget, and you need to get it approved by those political sponsors. I've always said to people when they come to me early in a project and say, how much is this going to cost, that it's a nonsense to ask me for a price until we have agreed the plan. It's critical that we have a plan which measures the effort, the resource level, and the time before we can possibly put a cost on it. Learning that if something cannot be measured, then it cannot be controlled and monitored is another key skill. And for that reason, it's very advisable early on in the project to create a project office, which will be responsible for doing that measuring and for reporting back to the steering committee and the executive committees of the project to make sure that all the boxes are getting ticked. You also need to put in place a project risk factor analysis, a risk scope document that allows you to consider what are the risks to this project and how can you mitigate against those risks. And from an administrative point of view, it's important to create a formal document filing and retrieval system so that anyone working on the project knows where documents are being held and where guidance can be and training can be received. You need to monitor that budget against the actual performance and put in place change management policies around the project so that if there are variables to the original plan, the effect of those variations are clearly identified and the plan is kept up to date. A plan is not a passive thing, it's a proactive thing that needs to be managed actively. And when you're doing your project management measurement of within the project office, do not allow people to get into the habit of telling you that something has been 99% done. One of the things you learn very quickly is that 99% done is not done. People need to sign off that a particular task has been fully completed. Let's look at testing and training, because the two things go very much hand in hand. We, first of all, have to establish a testing environment that accurately reflects what will be the live environment. And this is true not just for technology projects, but for all other projects. If we are going to test, we need to be sure that we are testing the right things. We're looking to achieve knowledge transfer, and we talked already about the relationship between suppliers and consulting support with the actual full-time employees. But it's those full-time employees who need to receive the knowledge transfer. And there's no substitute for that investment in education. And there are many tools to automate that education, which will allow you to define who needs to know what and when, and will allow you then to test that knowledge levels, particularly of users, as they go through. We're looking to test three things. First of all, the integration of our new solution into the existing business processes, particularly technology. We talk about interface testing, and you'll be surprised how complex some of these structures can be and how multiple interfaces need to be tested. We're also looking for regression testing, in other words, to make sure that our solution is both robust and scalable. Too many, particularly in the consumer area, web-based solutions have crashed at the first time of high volume. And then you cannot overlook the security. In our current data protection age, you need to be absolutely sure that your systems are secure and are only accessible from authorized users. And to neglect such testing just exposes the business to risks that your political sponsors just would not accept. So the final thing, of course, is users, and you have to be able to free them up from the day job and measure their level of understanding. And you need to get some pre-go live sign-off from those users that the testing and training is complete. And there's no substitute for that sign-off going back up to the steering committee and then giving the okay for a go live. Now, we're already running out of time a little bit, so I'll be brief, but in the go live, we're looking at obviously a whole range of solutions. Some of the most popular of those tend to be those who say, well, we'll make the change in one day, namely over a holiday or a weekend. But of course, there are risk profiles attached to that that people need to understand and evaluate. The great beauty of Big Bang, the next day reconciliations, the long weekends, we've all been there, we've all done it. So much easier to do a staged rollout, either of the full functionality by doing it by department or by section, but then finally incrementally bringing on additional functionality. So the options are there. They're all based around the risk assessment, and we don't want to find that we suddenly have the wrong solution. And finally, when we've completed our project, we need to sit back and we need to review and conduct what it might be seen as a wash-up. We need to look at the lessons we've learned from this project and try and ensure that the positive ones are taken forward and the negative ones are not repeated. And we need to get the steering committee and the political sponsors to sign off and agree that the project has been concluded, to make that evaluation of whether all the benefits have been achieved. And it's always wise to perhaps keep that consultant around for another couple of days, another couple of months, and not be afraid to see that as the insurance to make sure that that knowledge transfer has been fully recovered. Remember, it is your existing staff who will have to support new applications, new processes, and if you have not taught them well, the project will fail. I hope that's been useful. Let's pass the message back to Dylan to close the session.
David, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. Now, hopefully you can see my screen again. And what I wanted to do is also to thank our BCS colleague, Joaquin Grant, who's been technical control of this session. Now, I hope you found this video useful. My email is shown on screen, and as before, feel free to email me if you wish, and especially if you too would like to present a non-commercial video up to about 15 minutes long for this library of videos. I look forward to seeing you and your colleagues at other sessions in this library of videos. See you soon. Goodbye for now.